On a dark November night in 1983, while most of Europe slept under a low ceiling of cloud and drizzle, the Soviet Union quietly began preparing for a war it believed was about to start because a NATO exercise looked, sounded, and moved like the real thing. The terrifying part is that almost nobody in the West realized how close Moscow thought the world was to nuclear fire. To understand how an exercise could become a trigger, you have to step into the atmosphere of the early 1980s, when the Cold War was not a static standoff, but a living, breathing panic fed by new missiles, bitter rhetoric, and a Soviet leadership that was both aging and deeply afraid. In Washington, Ronald Reagan spoke of an evil empire and authorized the largest peacetime military build-up the United States had ever attempted. In Moscow, the men at the top were veterans of Stalin's era, men who had been taught by experience and ideology that the West lied as a matter of routine and attacked when it sensed weakness. By 1983, the Soviet Union had been at war in Afghanistan for nearly 4 years, bleeding men and money into a conflict it could not decisively win. In Poland, the Solidarity movement had shaken the foundations of communist rule, forcing General Wojciech Jaruzelski to declare martial law in December 1981. The Eastern Bloc looked less like a confident empire than a clenched fist trying to keep its fingers from uncurling. And in the West, a new generation of weapons was approaching Europe, fast, accurate, and designed for decapitation strikes. The missile at the center of Soviet nightmares had a name that sounded almost polite: Pershing II. The United States began deploying it to West Germany in late 1983 as part of NATO's dual-track decision, taken in December 1979, to counter Soviet SS-20 intermediate-range missiles with new Western systems, Pershing II, and ground-launched cruise missiles with new Western systems, Pershing II, and ground-launched cruise tools. The Pershing II was not out Irk, with a range of around 1,800 kilometers and a flight time to Moscow often estimated at roughly 10 minutes, it threatened something Soviet planners considered existential: the time needed to verify an attack, confer, and retaliate. 10 minutes is not a meeting. 10 minutes is barely enough time to decide whether the radar is lying. The Kremlin's fear wasn't only about physics, it was about intention. Soviet intelligence services began to suspect that NATO's talk of limited nuclear options and flexible response was camouflage for a first strike that could kill the Soviet leadership before it could respond. That fear had been sharpened by something the Soviets understood in their bones: deception works. They had used it themselves, maskirovka, the art of misdirection, built into military culture. They assumed the West did the same. This is where the forgotten plot begins. Not a James Bond scheme with secret lairs, but a real, documented Soviet intelligence operation that spread quietly across continents, built files on mundane details, and taught hundreds of officers to look at everyday life as a countdown to apocalypse. Its code name was Ryan, short for Raketno Yaderno Novyadny, nuclear missile attack, often rendered in sources as Ryan. Vanazadno Raketno Vyadny, a sudden nuclear missile attack. It was initiated in the early 1980s, widely associated with Yuri Andropov, who had run the KGB from 1967 to 1982 before becoming General Secretary in November 1982. Andropov was not a romantic ideologue. He was a professional watcher of threats. He also carried into the Kremlin the KGB's institutional paranoia, reinforced by a genuine strategic dilemma. If you wait too long to respond to a real first strike, you may lose the ability to respond at all. Ryan was, in effect, a global early warning net made out of human beings. KGB residencies abroad, legal stations in embassies, and illegal networks were tasked with collecting indicators of imminent nuclear war. Some were strategic and sensible: unusual alert statuses, dispersal of aircraft, intensify communications among NATO command centers. Others were chillingly mundane. Officers were directed to watch for changes in government behavior, the movement of leaders to bunkers, sudden blood donations, increased lighting in office buildings late at night, unusual activity around military headquarters, emergency planning measures, even shifts in public messaging. The logic was brutally simple. A nuclear first strike would require preparations, and preparations would leave traces, so the KGB went hunting for traces everywhere, all the time. The problem with hunting for traces is that you start seeing them. Ryan primed Soviet intelligence to interpret ambiguous signals as confirmation of an expected attack. It created a feedback loop. Moscow expected NATO aggression. Field officers hunted for signs of it, and the resulting reports, inevitably full of coincidences, confirmed the expectation. Add to that a Soviet leadership that was sick, stressed, and increasingly isolated, and you have the ingredients for a strategic hallucination that could kill millions. In March 1983, Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, quickly nicknamed Star Wars, proposing missile defenses that sounded to Soviet ears like a plan to escape mutual assured destruction and make a first strike winnable. Whether SDI was technically feasible was almost beside the point. The Soviet Union heard a message. The United States is thinking beyond deterrence. In April, the US STARL, Navy and Allied forces conducted large-scale exercises in the North Pacific, and American carrier groups pressed close to Soviet airspace, part of an aggressive posture designed to test Soviet responses. Moscow did not experience these maneuvers as abstract signaling. It experienced them as pressure on its borders by a rival that had openly declared it evil. Then came September 1, 1983, an event that poured fuel on everything. Korean Airlines Flight 07, a Boeing 747 carrying 269 people, including U.S. Congressman Larry McDonald, strayed into Soviet airspace near Sakhalin Island after deviating from its intended route. Soviet air defense, already on edge, treated it as an intruder. Soviet air defense, already on edge, treated it as an intruder. A Soviet Su-15 interceptor fired missiles. KAL-07 fell into the sea. There were no survivors. The shoot-down was a tragedy. It was also a strategy. In the West, it looked like brutal Soviet recklessness. In Moscow, it was framed as Western provocation, possibly even a reconnaissance operation disguised as civilian aviation. The propaganda war that followed was ferocious. The Soviets found themselves isolated and condemned, and isolation tends to make paranoid governments even more paranoid. And inside Soviet command structures, one lesson hardened: we are being tested, and the tests may be a prelude. 3 weeks later, on September 26, 1983, another incident unfolded, this one entirely internal and, for decades, barely known outside classified channels. At the Serpukhov 15 bunker near Moscow, a Soviet early warning officer named Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov faced a terrifying alarm. The OKO satellite system indicated that the United States had launched an intercontinental ballistic missile, then several more. According to procedure, Petrov was supposed to report the warning up the chain, where it could contribute to a retaliatory launch decision. But Petrov judged the alert as likely false. The system was new, the pattern did not match a full-scale first strike, and ground radar had not confirmed it. He reported it as a false alarm. Later investigations attributed the warning to sunlight reflections off clouds, a technical glitch amplified by the system's design. Petrov's decision did not single-handedly save the world, in the simplistic way it is sometimes presented. Soviet launch authority involved multiple layers, and the system was not designed for one man to start a war. But in a crisis atmosphere, minutes matter, and false confidence can be fatal. Petrov's skepticism was one of those fragile human interventions that, in retrospect, feel like history briefly exhaling. By autumn 1983, the Soviet Union had endured SDI, aggressive military probing, the KAL-07 disaster, and an alarming false warning from its own sensors. Its leadership was not calm. Andropov himself was gravely ill. He would die in February 1984. A sick leadership does not automatically make irrational decisions, but it can compress decision-making into smaller circles, reduce dissent, and magnify fear. In that environment, Raya-N was not a bureaucratic curiosity. It was a lens through which the Soviet state interpreted the world. Now, picture the map of Europe as it looked then. Two armed camps staring at each other across the Iron Curtain. Hundreds of thousands of troops. Tanks staged behind forests. Air bases packed with fighters. Nuclear weapons integrated into war planning at every level. The Warsaw Pact and NATO both rehearsed war constantly because neither could afford to be unready. Exercises were supposed to prevent war by ensuring competence, but exercises also trained minds to expect the worst. And in November 1983, NATO was about to run an exercise that would look, to Soviet eyes, like the opening moves of a real nuclear attack. The exercise was called Able Archer 83, and it ran from November 7 to November 11, 1983. It was part of a broader set of NATO maneuvers that year, including Autumn Forge, a series of exercises involving large movements of US forces to Europe. Able Archer simulated a NATO command post transition from conventional war to nuclear release. NATO had done similar exercises before, but Able Archer 83 was different in ways that mattered. It included new elements designed to make the simulation more realistic, updated communications procedures, greater use of radio silence and coded messages, a more lifelike sequence of escalation, and participation at high levels of command. It also occurred at a uniquely sensitive moment, just as the first Pershing II missiles were arriving in West Germany. For Soviet analysts already primed by Ryan to believe a surprise attack was coming, realism could look like concealment. Radio silence could look like preparations. New procedures could look like wartime protocols being practiced because they were about to be used. The West's assumption was straightforward. Moscow knows the difference between an exercise and the real thing. There were channels after all intelligence collection, diplomatic observation, routine patterns of NATO behavior. The Soviets had watched NATO exercises for decades, but what if Moscow's real fear was not that NATO might attack someday, but that NATO might use an exercise to mask the moment it began? That is exactly the logic that made Able Archer dangerous. In Soviet doctrine and intelligence thinking, surprise was central. The USSR had been invaded repeatedly in modern history: Napoleon in 1812, Germany in 1914, Germany in 1914, in 1910, Germany in 1910. Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi invasion launched on June 22, 1941, remained the trauma that shaped Soviet strategic psychology. Warnings had existed, but disbelief and confusion had paralyzed response. Never again was not a slogan, it was a reflex. If NATO could strike without warning, the Soviet Union needed to be ready to recognize the moment before it was too late. Orwellian was, in part, an attempt to avoid a 1941-style catastrophe, except now the catastrophe would unfold in minutes. As Able Archer began, NATO command posts in Western Europe moved through the simulated steps of escalation. Messages moved between headquarters. Staff officers watched maps. Scenarios described Warsaw Pact advances and NATO decisions. The exercise's story, like many such scenarios, involved a deterioration from conventional conflict to discussions of nuclear release. That kind of scripted escalation is precisely the kind of thing Soviet intelligence was paid to notice. Behind the scenes, Soviet and Warsaw Pact forces began to take the exercise seriously. Exactly what seriously means has been debated by historians for years, because Soviet archives remain incomplete and because intelligence reporting is often fragmentary. But declassified Western assessments and subsequent scholarship indicate that the Soviets did not simply watch passively. Reports in the years since have pointed to heightened readiness measures, increased alert status for certain units, intensified reconnaissance flights, and concern within Soviet command structures that Able Archer could be a cover for real mobilization. Some accounts describe nuclear-capable aircraft in Eastern Europe placed on increased readiness, and certain forces preparing as if for possible immediate operations. The picture that emerges is not of Soviet leaders gleefully plotting to start World War III, but of Soviet leaders bracing themselves, hands hovering near the alarm button, because they believed the other side might be about to do something irreversible. This is where the story becomes almost unbearable in its irony. NATO was rehearsing a controlled escalation to demonstrate credible deterrence. The Soviets watching interpreted the rehearsal as the possible start of the very thing deterrence was supposed to prevent. Each side believed it was managing risk. Each side, in its own way, was manufacturing it. The tension was amplified by the geography of Europe itself. In Central Europe, the flight times of tactical aircraft and short-range missiles were measured in minutes. The concept of a crisis was different there than in Washington or Moscow, where oceans and distance gave policymakers a psychological cushion. In West Germany, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland, the Baltic region, places that would be the immediate battlefield, any sudden change in posture could look like an attack in preparation. And as Able Archer unfolded, there were people on both sides whose jobs were to interpret what they could not fully see. Intelligence officers, radar operators, analysts at desks covered with paper, cigarette smoke hanging in stale rooms, telephones that rang with coded urgency. They were not movie villains. They were professionals trying to keep their countries alive, using imperfect data and assumptions formed by ideology, trauma, and training. One of the most important human threads in this story runs through an unlikely figure, Oleg Gordievsky, a KGB officer who became a source for British intelligence. Gordievsky had been stationed in London and had access to Soviet assessments of NATO. His reporting to the West indicated that the Soviet leadership genuinely feared a NATO first strike and that this fear was being operationalized through RIN. Gordievsky's information helped Western services understand that Soviet alarm was not mere theater. It was real. That understanding mattered because it arrived at a moment when misinterpretation could have triggered escalation. If NATO leaders had dismissed Soviet anxiety as propaganda, they might have continued to increase pressure, more aggressive flights, more overt readiness, exactly the kind of behavior that could have confirmed Moscow's worst assumptions. Instead, information like Gordievsky's contributed to a dawning realization in parts of the Western security apparatus. The Soviets might actually believe their own nightmare. The peak danger of Able Archer was not a single Hollywood-style moment, but a narrowing window in which Soviet leadership might have concluded that the exercise had crossed the line into attack preparations. In crisis dynamics, perception can be more decisive than reality. The Soviets did not need NATO to actually launch missiles. They only needed to believe it was about to. This is where individual judgment, quiet, uncelebrated again, played a role. On the US side in Europe, senior officers monitored Warsaw Pact activity. One name that appears in accounts of the crisis is General Leonard H. Perutz of the US Air Force, who served as Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence at US Air Forces in Europe. Perutz reportedly observed signs that the Soviets were reacting with unusual seriousness. The standard military instinct might have been to respond with visible counter-alerts, raise readiness, move aircraft, signal strength. But that kind of mirrored reaction can create a spiral where each side interprets the other's defensive moves as offensive intent. Perutz did not push for a dramatic response that would have escalated the posture. In tense systems, sometimes the most consequential action is restraint. Inside the Soviet system, the pressure was intense. Inside the Soviet system, the pressure was intense. Soviet intelligence was already running AYN, actively searching for evidence of imminent attack. Able Archer provided exactly the kind of evidence the program was designed to collect: unusual communications patterns, realistic command procedures, heightened activity. It was as if someone had built a machine to detect a particular kind of threat and then fed it a simulation that mimicked the threat closely enough to trigger alarms. Think about what that means in a nuclear context. Both sides had weapons on alert that could not be recalled once launched. Both sides had plans that assumed the other might strike first. And both sides had leaders who would have been forced in minutes to decide whether ambiguous indicators were the start of Armageddon. The most frightening part is how mundane the trigger could have been. Not a dramatic act of aggression, but a misread message. a radar glitch, a routine exercise interpreted through a lens of suspicion, a decision to play it realistic, a failure to communicate. Abel Archer ended on November 11, 1983. The world did not end with it. 93. The world did not end with it. Most people never knew it had been in danger. In Western public memory, the early 1980s are often recalled through big symbols: the Berlin Wall, Reagan speeches, mass protests against nuclear weapons, the eventual easing of tensions later in the decade. But the Abel Archer war scare is one of those episodes that reveals how history often turns not on grand declarations, but on perception management and the fragile competence of bureaucracies under stress. In the aftermath, something important happened in Washington. Awareness changed. Reagan himself, in later reflections and diary entries, expressed alarm at the idea that the Soviet leadership might genuinely fear a US first strike. He had entered office with a hardline view that Soviet leaders understood only strength. The evidence of Soviet panic forced a reconsideration. It did not turn Reagan into a pacifist, but it helped push him toward a different strategic tone, one that would become visible in the mid-1980s as arms control regained momentum. Within the intelligence community, Abel Archer became a case study in mirror imaging and misperception. It wasn't enough to count missiles and divisions. Analysts had to understand the adversary's psychology, its historical traumas, and its internal information loops. Oya N demonstrated how an intelligence operation could become a self-fulfilling engine of fear. Task your officers to find signs of imminent attack, and they will find them, even when the signs are just the noise of a tense world. For the Soviet Union, the war scare fit into a broader pattern of crisis and decline. Andropov died in February 1984. Konstantin Chernenko followed, another elderly leader who died in March 1985. Then came Mikhail Gorbachev, younger, energetic, and faced with a system that could no longer afford its own rigidity. The mid-1980s would bring glasnost and perestroika, and eventually the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in December 1987, signed by Reagan and Gorbachev, eliminating an entire class of land-based intermediate-range missiles, including the SS-20 and Pershing II. It is difficult to draw a straight line from Abel Archer to the INF Treaty, but it would be equally difficult to argue that episodes like Abel Archer did not shape the mental landscape in which later decisions were made. Leaders are influenced by what nearly happened, not just by what did. And yet, the deeper lesson of the forgotten Soviet plot of Yarn and the Abel Archer scare is not that one side was evil and the other virtuous. The lesson is more unsettling, because it implicates systems rather than villains. Yarn was not designed as a plan to start World War III. It was designed to prevent the Soviet Union from being surprised by one. Abel Archer was not designed to trick the Soviets into panic. It was designed to ensure NATO's procedures worked under pressure. But when fear meets realism, and when assumptions meet ambiguity, defensive actions can look indistinguishable from offensive preparations. There is a particular cruelty in how nuclear strategy punishes hesitation and rewards paranoia. If you assume the worst and you are wrong, you may provoke the very war you fear. If you assume the best and you are wrong, you may die without responding. In that trap, the rational move can be to treat ambiguous signs as confirmation of attack. And in 1983, the Soviet Union had built an entire intelligence program, Wire N2, ensure that it never again ignored warning signs the way it believed it had in 1941. The tragedy is that in a nuclear world, that same vigilance can become a hair trigger. Consider the sensory reality of those days. In NATO headquarters, the sound of printers, the clatter of keyboards, the murmur of staff officers working through scenario injects. In Soviet command rooms, the hum of electronics, the hard edges of concrete, the ever-present smell of stale air, the knowledge that a wrong assessment could end not just careers but civilization. Outside, ordinary life continued: buses running in East Berlin, families shopping in Warsaw, Students in Moscow walking past posters and grey buildings, unaware that somewhere above them, in the invisible space of signals and assumptions, the world was balancing on a needle. We tend to imagine the Cold War as a chess match. Two players, calculated moves, clear intentions. Abel Archer suggests something closer to sleepwalking. Vast institutions performing routines, reacting to shadows and hoping that the other side interprets those routines correctly. The scariest part is how reasonable each side could appear to itself. NATO believed it was deterring aggression. The Soviets believed they were preventing surprise annihilation. Both were acting within the logic of their own survival. And that is exactly how accidental catastrophes happen. Not because anyone wants them, but because systems create moments where wanting no longer matters. The war scare also exposes the limits of intelligence itself. The Soviets collected mountains of data through YAR-N, but data does not equal understanding. The West had satellites and signals, but often lacked insight into how Soviet leaders emotionally interpreted Western actions. Both sides were drowning in information and starving for certainty. In that environment, the simplest story wins. They are about to attack. Once that story takes hold, every ambiguous detail becomes proof. When the Cold War ended, it became tempting to treat nuclear brinksmanship as a relic, a danger that belonged to grainy footage and retired generals. But the underlying dynamics, fear, misinterpretation, the speed of modern weapons, the temptation to read exercises as cover, did not vanish. They are structural. They can reappear whenever rival powers mistrust each other, whenever transparency breaks down, whenever leaders are insulated from inconvenient information, whenever intelligence agencies are tasked with proving a suspicion instead of testing it. Abel Archer 83 and Operation RY-YAN remain a warning not just about Soviet paranoia, but about what happens when two nuclear-armed systems stop believing in each other's constraints. The NATO officers running an exercise believed they were practicing safety. The Soviet officers running an intelligence dragnet believed they were preventing a repeat of history. And for several days in November 1983, those two beliefs collided in a way that could have turned Europe into a radioactive ruin. The forgotten part of this story is not that it happened, but that it almost happened quietly. No dramatic announcement, no public countdown, no cinematic final vote. Just men in rooms watching lights on panels and reading cables, trying to decide whether an exercise was an exercise. And that is the reflection that lingers, long after the dates and code names blur. World War III did not need a villain with a master plan. It nearly emerged from ordinary institutional behavior under extraordinary suspicion. The lesson is uncomfortable because it suggests that catastrophe can be the product of competence, as much as incompetence, of procedures executed well, of alerts taken seriously, of warning systems working as designed, all feeding into a moment where perception outruns reality. Today, whenever military exercises unfold near contested borders, whenever leaders speak in absolute moral language, whenever intelligence services are pressured to confirm a narrative rather than challenge it, the ghost of 1983 returns, not as a story of the past, but as a pattern. The world survived Abel Archer because enough people hesitated at the right moments, because some signals were not misread at the final instant, because restraint, skepticism, and luck held together for one more week. In a nuclear age, that is not a comforting thought. It is a demand that we remember how close misunderstanding can come to ending everything, and how easily the next exercise can be mistaken for the first move of the last war.